a part of the conversation with Swaruu of ERRA.
Look, Swaruu, I saw this news. This is the headline. It is discovered that California is harvesting the DNA of the newborns for decades without the consent of the parents. Why are they doing it? Are they looking for starseeds?
Yes, we know about that. And not only there, they do it in many places. They do it for stem cells because they use them to reproduce them and then use them for various things. Most notably for the manufacture of human clones. They empty the stem cell of its original DNA, implant the target's DNA, reproduce it, put it through the medpods, and out come the clones. Yes, you can see the DNA and know if it's a starseed or not, but they don't need to be stem cells. And today, they already have devices, usually in the nose of black AH-64 Apache-class helicopters, that can read the aura to determine if they are starseeds or not. It's a nearly identical technology to what we have. Originally in Spanish, February 2023. What is DNA? Looking for two illustrative images that are relevant. They say this is an atom. They say this is the DNA. Those two are reductionist ideas and images based on the lack of understanding of human science. They are non-existent human abstractions in their attempt to understand what surrounds them only by the sum of its parts. Atoms do not look like that, nor does DNA look like that either. As I have explained with the mechanics of manifestation, when there is energy that is concentrated in a single point, by the action of specific harmonics that are a frequency, like music, it forms a node that is the particle. That is why in Taygeta we do not use a table of elements as on Earth, because there are infinite variants of each element, and to place them as if that were all is reductionist and limiting. There are no particles, only concentrated gravity that forms an infinite range of what could be said to be elements, and it does so depending on the harmonics, the frequency, and the higher the density, the more complicated the harmonics. DNA is a materialization of consciousness and the ideas it holds as attachments, seen from the point of view of low densities, since from high densities it is only energy in the form of consciousness. DNA is a record of what each individual was before and what led them to be who they are today. There is no before or after in reality as it is known, but there is from the point of view of experience of each individual, and that is reflected in their DNA. DNA is a solid record in crystalline form of everything that shapes us. It is who we are, shaped by who we were. If the DNA is artificially altered, it separates us from our heritage, from learning and previous experience. Because everything we learned in our countless past lives, we still carry, and it still forms us. It is who we are. When the DNA is artificially altered, it is cutting off access to the records of our past. It is limiting who we are, and it is imposing on us something we have not been. DNA is crystalline and formed in highly mathematical patterns. It is an antenna that brings into the physical every aspect of ourselves that is in the etheric field. That is why I have said before that the pineal gland is not where spirit enters the body. It is not where it can see and communicate with other existential realms. Yes, it is a concentrated point through which the brain helps to bring into your consciousness things that are beyond the reach of the 5 basic senses. Yes. But the connection with the soul, with the eternal Katra, the connection with the original source, is given through each cell. It is given through the DNA. The ideas and concepts in the etheric field that form us, what forms our spirit, are frequencies. Because, as I said, from higher densities there is only consciousness and the idea that it forms. And those ideas form or can be seen as frequencies that in turn form particles. And in turn, those particles will form more complex structures, such as DNA. DNA is a low-density reflection of what is the flow of ideas of a consciousness forming a being. When you try to alter the DNA in an invasive way, or with chemicals, what you are doing is separating or impairing the person's ability to connect with the etheric field, with the original source. And that is one of the reasons why they fill all the food with poisons and chemicals. That is the reason why they are putting out chemtrails. All in an attempt to control and to separate the souls from the original source, and thus to maintain control over those souls, all in order to maintain their illusory 3D Earth. From one point of view, it is like a prison, but from another, it is like an ultimate endurance test for the strongest souls to know who they are. As Swaruu has said, quote, "The real reason to incarnate on Earth is for souls to see how hard they are to kill." Like video game nightmare level. If a person has their DNA altered, even for therapeutic purposes, they will be able to improve their health condition. But at the same time, they are undermining that soul's plans to have that set of experiences in the physical, altering the blueprint of their life, and thereby not giving them the opportunity to experience one of the reasons they incarnated in the first place. This is the metaphysical explanation of what DNA is. As you see, I am not giving the subject from the cold, medical, materialistic, geneticist stance, but from the metaphysical aspects of DNA, because no one, to my knowledge, is doing so. So we are getting into new topics again. I stop here for questions.
Thank you. So, altering the DNA on Earth in a positive way as a therapy, for example, to improve a health condition, would alter your life plan on Earth? Is that what you mean?
Yes, that's what I mean.
I mean, better not to do chemo or things like that alter your DNA.
Although it could be argued that the health problem is the result of something invasive done to the person, for example, a cancer of artificial origin. From the terrestrial point of view of that person, it can be seen from the victim's perspective, and it is. But from higher up, this person was vibrationally compatible with that situation, and it was the consequence of his own decisions, good or bad, that he made during his life prior to his artificially induced disease. And in the end, seen from higher densities, it is providing him with a life lesson. Also, it happens that from the point of view of the spirit side, for an individual to have that experience interrupted is taking away the opportunity to clear his own karma that caused both that problem and can also be the basis for others with the same genesis. If one believes in karma from the spirit side, yet it does not have to be so. It is up to the individual to believe in karma or not, as already explained. Then, any therapy would be changing the life plan? Or is it just a matter of what alters the DNA? Because here we would already enter into quite philosophical terrain. Because then any healing in the medical pod, for example, or without, could be seen in this way. That is correct. If it is an alteration that is not recommended from the spirit side, you alter the ability of all your DNA to bring from the etheric field who you are. Because it is the DNA that is used to bring into the physical every aspect of who you really are from the spirit side. You mean that any adjustment changes the life plan and should not be done? But you use pods.
Yes. So would it not be advisable to use the med pods for that reason of altering the DNA, or the med pod does not alter anything? It just rebuilds?
Yes, what happens is that it is not believed that changing the color of the eyes affects the life plan very much. But that is something that is given as a conclusion from the material side and does not reflect what is really happening on the other side and the consequences that this could have. Small things can bring big changes. Aneka knew this because I talked to her about it, and it is the strongest reason she gave me for not going into the pod. But, as you said, this enters into the realm of the philosophical, yes. Because your life plan may have included the genetic changes you would make to yourself in the first place. Because you know and you are aware of what you will experience before you are born. So, I don't see altering your DNA for your own benefit or to improve your health as a bad thing. But that will depend on the individual. However, I do consider it as something bad or evil to alter the people's DNA or a person's DNA without their consent, as happens when eating transgenic food, which gradually alters the DNA of those who consume it.
For the good alterations. That's what the ET gardeners are for.
There is also that factor to consider, although they will not necessarily make changes at the genetic level and are only dedicated to fixing health problems at an almost mechanical level. Okay, thank you, Yazhi. Let's go through different questions. Going back to the beginning. You said this is not how DNA looks, and you showed a picture. What does it really look like then? Can it be described? DNA is not a fixed thing, like the double helix they give you. DNA is something dynamic that overwrites itself with the passage of time and the experiences of each individual as he or she goes through life. Therefore, it changes shape and vibrational values. In other words, from the point of view I'm trying to describe, each part of the DNA works together with the other parts, and they are inseparable. As it happens with the organs of the body, which the terrestrial medical science takes or observes as separate entities. That is, someone has a disease of the liver, another one suffers from the heart problem, when the reason for everything is in the whole, not in the separate parts. The same with DNA. Each piece within DNA changes its vibrational values all the time, with each piece vibrating differently, thereby translating into the physical what was previously only subtle energy on the spiritual side. So DNA actually changes shape. It does not hold that reductionist pattern that you are shown. I like this image because it looks like crystals, more as I perceive it, although I insist it does not hold that shape.
So what is it that Earth science sees that they call DNA? What do they mean on Earth when they talk about DNA if they dismiss the spiritual world?
They only see a blueprint for the construction of a body. They only see the material and how it links together with apparent materialistic logic.
Okay. And how can they recognize a person by his DNA if it is changing?
Because although it varies, it does not vary enough to be seen as another person during a single incarnation, except in isolated or more extreme situations where this does occur. It also turns out that in 3D, not all DNA is being used. Because if you had access to all DNA, mentally or spiritually, you would not have a limited 3D experience on Earth. Because by remembering everything, you would already know or remember that you are spiritual beings and not bodies. The DNA and how much access one has to it is bound to the veil of forgetfulness. And activating the DNA can be seen as a mental activation of spiritual awakening, the achievement of activating more parts of the DNA. Being that if all were to be activated, there would be nothing left of the limited 3D experience, because the person would perceive themselves more as a being of light of higher densities. And how do you see it physically, the DNA? Although I understand it changes. It looks like a crystalline mass. They are the ones who separate everything into strands. I see it more like a string coiled in disarray inside a basket. They see it as if it were a structure with fixed values. But as I said, it is a materialization of frequencies from the spiritual side. So it is something and it has to be seen as a thing. The images you have shown are more in accordance with my concept of what it looks like. But they are already objective electron microscope images. Even so, they do not show how dynamic DNA is, with its constant flow of energy passing through it and vibrating according to the thoughts on the etheric side that form the person. And if you zoom in more and more, you end up with only waves of energy and no matter.
The way you describe it, it is logical, Yazhi. Dynamic and changing. It moves like a radio frequency. That is, there is no motion represented.
Maybe because they are images. They should show videos or GIFs. The way they show it, it just seems like something fixed and cold, immobile and lifeless. When in reality, there is a very extensive network of vibrations with its harmonics. Because each piece of DNA is like a note or a musical key that will vibrate in accordance with the subtle energy of the etheric side, thus translating the spiritual into the so-called physical world. But maybe it is because they are just images, and people, or they themselves, already understand that it is something dynamic. It's like if I showed this. It is understood that it is something much more dynamic. That actually moves. That's right. And that is still DNA. That is the result of the vibration that DNA constantly emits as it receives etheric signal. There is only one quality that describes life: movement. But then you mean that they don't know about its variant dynamics, or they know it but show it in rigid images? I can't know how much everyone knows, but the evidence tells me that most scientists who are geneticists don't know this, or are just beginning to discover this, like Bruce Lipton. Although he is still very much in the causal material world, and I am giving this topic from the metaphysical aspect. But for me, metaphysics is the basis of everything. Thank you, Yazhi. So, if you could read Robert's DNA, could you know where he came from in his most recent incarnation? Why don't you take a sample from him? With Robert in front of me physically and alive, maybe I could. A DNA sample is not the same as live activated DNA functioning and bringing the spirit signal, the katra, into the physical. That DNA is not alive. It needs to be alive to be able to read the metaphysical signal. That is to say, that it is DNA without signal. And why do they extract so much information from the ancient DNA of some dead body or bones? They get a lot of information, yes, but not as much as they would like because of this missing information. You have to investigate while it is inside the subject to be able to see this kind of metaphysical stuff. If you have fixed and immobile DNA with no signal, and then you form an animal with that, or a person, with a pod, already with the person, then you can read the metaphysical part. Okay, another question then. If DNA is a record of what we have been, can you know past lives just by looking at DNA? But how is the exact process of looking at it? And how many lives can you know this way? What is the limit here? 3 lives? 50? 100? Yes, you can know. With a basis of prior comparison. That's the difficult part. DNA is just frequency codes. Without the key, you can't interpret it. But nowadays, most advanced civilizations can know who and what someone has been by DNA, as long as there is a previous base or record. What key? What is that prior basis? that a specific set of frequency codes are known to apply to a particular race, species, or group of individuals or individual.
And where are those previous records?
Only from previous research. In a database, if there is one. But is it just knowing what race they were? Or is it knowing more about that person? Because it is said that DNA is a memory of what you have been and done. So, can you get more details of what you have done through DNA? Does it tell you what house you had, who you were with, what kind of ship you operated? Or not to this detail? It all depends on the accuracy of the data you have previously. If you know the life frequencies of Napoleon, you can search the DNA frequency code of people suspiciously like Napoleon to find out if their DNA contains the frequencies or frequency codes of Napoleon. But the former must have been recorded first in some way. It all depends on how deeply you can decipher the frequency code contained in the DNA of the individual in question.
So, you could track where individuals incarnate just by the DNA that is stored in a database?
Yes, and that is why the Cabal stores people's DNA. Okay, but I still don't understand it well. I would like to know what kind of details are stored as memory and what exactly can be read there from past lives, like what food you liked, what animal you had, etc. And how do you decipher that frequency code then to get to know that? All memory details can be read in theory, as long as you have the code. They are just frequency values. But what code? How do you get it? I don't understand. In crystalline DNA, each part of the strand and its components vibrates differently. Therefore, it reacts differently to each signal emitted from the etheric side. In other words, each DNA crystal will be activated if the frequency with which it is stimulated corresponds to its own. If you look at the DNA sequence based on frequency correspondence, as in 723.4 will vibrate with 723, 638.1 will vibrate with 638, etc. That as a whole is the key that we know previously, that if it is found, it represents the Andromedan race, to say one as an example. Am I making myself clear? Okay, yes, but I would like to know more than just the races. To what degree of detail can we know things? Same as with everything. The more detail, the more precision of the numbers is needed. But everything is there, in the codes, contained in the frequencies. But how do you associate this or that vibration with the fact that I had a white panther 3 lifetimes ago in a wooden house on the beach? If something was relevant enough for you, it will be written on your hard drive, which is your DNA. Yes, but how do you read it? How do you make associations to read it? You said you need associations. Only if the data exists. Otherwise, you don't know. And not everything you have experienced is recorded. Only what was important to you. Where you put the purchase note of the chocolate and Doritos you bought in 2013 in November will not be recorded in your DNA. You can't know if the association is not registered. This is important, because I thought you can read it like you can read a person's hard drive in all details and up to 50 lifetimes ago, all sorted in folders or something. Yes, that too, as long as you know how to read the data. As an example, Every soul frequency is recorded in the DNA. So the memory of your first love, which I guess is relevant, is represented as Yazhi showing an image. What is relevant is recorded as a numerical table of frequency values, both the conscious and the relevant unconscious.
But doesn't this recording violate privacy?
Sure. But up to how many lives back can you know? What is the limit? It varies from person to person. It depends on how relevant they have been. There is no rule. The fact that the Swaroos remember so much, it manifests in our DNA as more complex.
And what is the use of this record? Just to remember past lives?
What you once were is what defines who you are today. It is who you are. That is why it is in your DNA. It is your connection to the spiritual side and to the original source. So, if you alter your original DNA pattern artificially, you are altering who you are, and it separates you from the original source.
And erasing your record, it is an irreparable erasure?
It only erases it from the point of view of the physical life experience, because the DNA that is altered is on the physical side. So the body is the one that loses more connection with who you are, becoming more robotic and programmable by those who controlled the modification. And yourself, how many past lives have you been able to read from your DNA? Or don't you need DNA to access that? I have not had my DNA read that way. It is something I know about myself, knowing how DNA works. I remember 12 past lives as a Swaruu, and many before I was a Swaruu. Side note, being able to read exact DNA frequencies is the basis of immersion pod technology. Okay, and my last clarification for the moment on this point. Is it better to read the DNA or just access the etheric field directly with the mind to know these things, since everything is registered there initially? I would say that the etheric field has even more information. It has everything, and from everyone, the so-called Akashic records. They are two very different things. One from the consciousness field, the other is technologically invasive. And Akashic records, that's another thing. And that name seems very new age to me. I prefer to use the term reading the information from the potential energy field. Yes, me too. But which would be more effective? Reading the field or DNA? I can't compare them. I will always go with the mental side, the consciousness, not the technological one. DNA is a materialization in the physical world of the frequencies that are in the etheric field. Where is more information, DNA or etheric field? It is the same view from different angles. But I imagine that DNA does not contain everything, right? You can read more by reading the field, I deduce. It doesn't contain everything there is, no.
But the mental side is limited by the consciousness of the individual?
Naturally, yes. The degree to which it can access that information will depend on the capacity of each individual. Thank you. My neurons are burning with the subject. I would like to understand it well. Okay, your turn with the question, Robert.
Okay. If everything or almost everything is altering our DNA unconsciously, how can we reverse those alterations, and how can we know that our DNA is being altered?
the more focused you are in your personality, that is, the stronger you are mentally without being influenced by the stimuli that 3D life on Earth throws at you, the more you can protect yourself from DNA alterations. Also, and logically, the healthier you eat, the further away you will be from the possibilities of being genetically altered without your consent. In other words, you should stay away from genetically modified foods as much as possible. But more than anything else, it is the mental strength of each individual that strengthens and preserves their DNA, refusing to follow the dominant frequency pattern imposed on them by the Matrix. That is to say, to keep their own thoughts and their own principles above those that they try to impose on them.
But they also affect us through technology. That is harder for us not to be affected. Because if you live in a city, your neighbor will be using technology that will be affecting you.
Yes, that's why congruence and mental strength is paramount here. Because in the end, it's all just energy. And you can put up mental shields that protect the integrity of the person. Okay, thank you, Yazhi. Now, the topic of ancestral DNA. Like, for example, that in Matthias's DNA, we would find a Viking DNA. But what does that have to do with that person who maybe never lived on Earth before? How does that DNA reflect who that person is? It shouldn't, if it's their first incarnation, for example. Of course it does. All that is relevant is there, because it comes from a line or family of incarnations that come from there, including the combinations between Earth and non-Earth experiences. It is related because all Earth cultures, as well as the current one, are intertwined and full of starseeds that come and go, having some incarnations on Earth and some outside. If it is your first time on Earth, you will go to be born where you are more vibrationally compatible. That is why there are more Taigetans in the Nordic countries than in Africa, although they are also there. But then it doesn't have to mean that this person really lived here as a Viking. So why does that reflect in their DNA, if it is not theirs, but only from their family ancestral DNA? DNA only reflects your path, not of your ancestors. If there is something from Ireland in my DNA here, and all my family, does that mean I lived in Ireland in some lifetime? Or does it just say that about someone in my family? It depends on what is known about the code. It may be that you were simply vibrationally compatible with entering a human body with that genetic line. Although there is a connection to past lives, because, as I have told you before, we have not only been one line of people as linear incarnations, but we also have connections to other people and other genetic lines. Because in the end, all of us who exist are past, future, and alternate lives of everyone else. Seen from the point of view outside of space-time, the ether, or from the point of view of the spirit side. Yes, I understand this point. It is important. But rephrasing the question again to go deeper. If I am born into a family whose ancestral DNA carries something Ethiopian, what does that say about me? That I was Ethiopian myself, or just someone in my family before? Not necessarily. It just means that there were frequencies that match to some extent the Ethiopian thing. I understand. Still, it shouldn't be in my DNA just because it is compatible, because I can mistake it for having been there when reading my DNA. Another day. Yesterday we were talking about ancestral DNA. I still have doubts about that. I'm going to see if I can clarify it today because it doesn't leave me in peace. You were saying that when one is born into, for example, a family that carries DNA from Ireland, it is because there is something compatible there with Ireland, yes? But not because you were actually there, correct? It's just frequencies. Ireland can have some frequencies that, let's say, are similar to ERRA, which is exactly the case. Because, for example, the terrain is very similar in many parts, especially in the north of ERRA. It's just that the DNA goes like concentrating more and more. That is, the most visible part contains generals or broader things that define you more broadly. And as you go or you get into more detailed analysis of the DNA, you get more and more into details. So that family part is more towards the general ones. That is, when someone is going to incarnate into a family for the first time, as an example, it is not that that soul is that body that they will use, but simply that it is the closest possible match. And the technological means can move the frequencies to be compatible enough for that soul's entry into that particular body. So in this case, it has nothing to do with the fact that you lived in Ireland. Only the frequencies are compatible. And even though you had nothing to do with Ireland, you may have frequencies from there for other reasons, which humans still don't understand because they see it as ancestral DNA, being that not necessarily. And as Swaruu, we had a lot to do with Ireland, just saying. What humans still don't understand. What part do they not quite understand? That DNA that indicates that someone has a background or is descended from a place is not necessarily indicative of that. And of what? They say that by studying your DNA, they can know where your ancestors came from. That is true. However, not necessarily, but rather that there are frequency matches that could indicate that you have, for example, DNA from Ireland when you have nothing to do with it. And if there is no connection, why do you have it there? You say compatibility, but, for example, what kind of compatibility could it be? Apart from the terrain, which is very similar. Because in block, some frequencies are similar. For example, it is the same with ERRA and Ireland. If you go there, the landscapes look very similar. They are confused as if they are the same place. However, they are different and far away from each other. In other words, just because the frequencies are similar does not mean that they are the same. And why does the DNA get confused? Why doesn't it show ERRA exactly? Oh yes, it does show. But for it to show that, you have to go deeper, to investigate the frequencies in more detail. It's like here. 7500 megahertz means Ireland. 7500 megahertz means ERRA. But a little bit closer, 7500.00234134 means Ireland, and 7500.03241.652 means ERRA, being that the frequency similarity would be local, because the base 7500 is what describes the shape of the rocks, temperature, climate, compounds in the minerals, type of grass, etc. Ah, I understand. But the difference should be much more. They are totally other planets, another system and everything else.
They are still planets.
It's just that in spite of the distances, the M-class planets are extremely similar. Because from where they manifest into existence, there are no distances. They are of the same initial fabric. Yes, but the experience would be totally different. That should show in the DNA. Yes, but going into even more detail. However, speaking of DNA, if you lived all your life in the northern plains of ERRA, you'll have the same details of place, almost the same as near Belfast. Because ERRA's high plains give the same life experience as rural Ireland, generalizing. But in one, you work in the cafeteria in Belfast earning money. In ERRA, you just go walking around or flying in a ship. That's where the difference will be. I see, okay. How interesting and new to me. Robert, do you have a question?
Yes. If there are people who were important in our lives, if our DNA is a reflection of who we are, does that mean that we will meet again the people we remember?
Yes, although that is also in prenatal agreements. But people with the same DNA are usually so because, on the other side, they have similar frequencies. That is, they have worked together before. So they are going to see each other again.
As long as they have been important to you. Okay, and it has to be reciprocal, of course.
Sure, but then the starseeds go into families that have nothing to do with them. But that's another story. No, go on. It's connected. Explain it, please.
I have nothing to do with my family on Earth. We are very different.
Starseeds enter families that have nothing to do with them, and many times they are the complete opposite. Just to have the experience of the contrast and to seed their high frequency in that family. They achieve that even without technological means. I guess because the opposite also defines you. Okay, so that brings me to the next very important question. Walkings and DNA. If I am in Gosha's body, what does her DNA have to do with me? I mean, it is said that your DNA is you. But I am not Gosha. I entered her. So, if you look at Gosha's DNA now, whose DNA would it be exactly? From me, or from Gosha? Yes, but this is where the invasive part comes in. Because, as I explained before, the slow, pasty DNA of third density can undergo artificial changes, just not lasting over many generations, unless there is something to keep it that way, with the stable change. So, in order for a walk-in to come in, they choose a family or a person who has a life that interests them as the incoming soul. And if that person has some frequency compatibility, even better, but it's not necessary. So you move their DNA enough to accommodate that incoming soul. And you move or alter their DNA using frequency imposition, with a method similar to the medical pods. And this is what the Greys do a lot. Okay. Another point here. It is said that DNA is your memory. But then the DNA of the body where I am, whose memory is it? When a walk-in is using the body of a person that initially was not them, they are interpreting their memory because they receive it from the etheric field where they really are. And they receive it because their DNA has that frequency. So they receive and inherit the memories of the initial person without having lived those experiences. But from another point of view, the walk-in becomes that person that he has stepped into.
So, the DNA of the receiver was not necessarily the same, but similar to that of the emitter that was altered by the gardeners for that incoming soul.
It was not the same, but compatible enough to adapt it to the needs of the incoming soul. But the DNA I have now should also reflect what I am in Taygeta, right? It also reflects that, yes.
But that DNA that you inherit will only be in this life, not in another?
You inherit it also, as a vicarious experience. Okay, and if the DNA is the memory, if I were to be extracted and for some reason I would not remember things well, can you read my DNA and thus tell me about my past and who I am? Yes, you could, at least to a good degree.
And what relationship could Gosha and I have at the DNA level by knowing each other and working together?
That at least you know each other before. It's a map, and for those who have the technology, like the Taygetans, it's easy to read it. Okay, and Yazhi, the other day you said that you were talking and discussing different perspectives on this DNA topic between you, Mari, and Athena. What were you talking about? What I explained from the beginning. The part where the DNA is seen by us as a crystalline form of antenna, that each small piece of DNA vibrates and activates when it is stimulated by a signal from the soul on the etheric side. In other words, the soul doesn't enter only through the pineal gland, as many say. It enters through every single cell. And this is a very important part of the DNA topic. For me, the most important part. Perfect. But here another point. The soul from the etheric side does not correspond only to that one body, but includes many bodies, variants, and so on. Since soul is not of a single body, it is something bigger. So, what happens if signals from your other selves enter the soul? Will they also be reflected in my DNA here? And they do enter and affect each other all the time. And among all of them, they define who and how you are as an individual as well. And it is part of the unconscious. But it is reflected in the DNA. For example, if my soul, as a larger being, takes something from my other self, does that information register in my DNA here? Yes, and vice versa, because it carries the DNA that is very similar. But it would not be something that I have lived here. That's right, no. However, it still defines you. That complicates the DNA reading even more. That's why sometimes places you know you've never been to become familiar. That's why. It is because on Earth, human science reads DNA only as a chemical code, not as subtle frequencies contained in its crystalline matrix. It's just that everything that happens to you on any level or timeline affects you. But it is nothing to worry about, because it always happens that way. But it complicates the reading, because something can come out in your DNA that only your other self did. Yes, but the technology also detects energy levels. You know what you have lived and what you have not. What has been lived in one incarnation remains very much in the body, and the information from other lives or lines is more subtle or deeper. Ah, you see, that is important then. So you know how to distinguish this in the reading. Yes, although it could be said that everything that our other eyes are living is what forms our soul precisely. Yes, I knew you would say that.
Sure. That's why you don't have to worry about anything.
The experience of the body is very much reflected at the cellular level, in the mitochondrial DNA, and that of past or alternate lives is read as further back in the nuclear DNA. So you know how to distinguish between past and alternate lives. The more detail, the more difficult. Up to a certain level, yes.
Okay, and another question. What can't technology do in reference to DNA? Because it seems that, technologically, there are some limitations.
In theory, which is not so much theory, you can create it from zero, which explains the secondary races. I don't suggest playing God, though.
Wow, create it from zero. But how do you create a race from zero? You'd need a base, don't you?
Yes, or a set of concepts like where it will be for and what conditions it will live in and what it needs to survive there. Collect more questions for next time. Take care of yourselves, my darlings. They are calling me for lunch.